It's the night before Destiny 2's next expansion, The Final Shape. Servers have been offline since 12 p.m. Eastern as Bungie prepares what is supposed to be the final installment in the Light and Dark saga. 10 years of storytelling is coming to a close with this expansion, and while I haven't been playing the game since day one of Destiny's first beta, it still feels like a good time to offer up a retrospective of my own journey as a Guardian. As a side note, I am likely just going to be throwing some random GM footage up in the background for this, so feel free to just listen to this in the background. Funny enough, I did actually play the Destiny 1 beta for about an hour or so. When it was announced, I was intrigued by what Bungie was doing solely because of how much I loved their work on Halo. I had played and beaten every mainline Halo game all the way through Reach, so I was excited to see what they had been cooking up. Unfortunately, I found myself confused by what the Destiny beta presented to me. Instead of a typical start menu, you had a world map with various places to select. I didn't understand how it worked, and I don't think I ever managed to find my way into an actual story mission, if one even existed at the time. I couldn't even tell you much about the experience other than I ran around the Cosmodrome for a while before giving up. It didn't make sense to me, and that's the easiest way to lose me as a player. I didn't think much of the game again until a few years later when someone from a community I had been entrenched in, shout out to John of All Games, was streaming the release of Destiny 2's Forsaken expansion. I sat and watched him sit through the cutscene where Cade 6 was killed and found myself mildly curious about the universe this franchise had built up. I wasn't sold on buying it just yet, but was considering it, and in November of 2018 I finally bit the bullet. I believe the Red War, Curse of Osiris, and Warmind were on sale, so I went full send and bought the entire package. I booted up the game, created a hunter, found my way to the Red War, and began working my way through the main story. At this stage, the game still mostly directed you to the main campaign, but it wasn't going to be that way for much longer, so I feel fortunate that I jumped in when I did. In any case, the main story was interesting, but didn't make a ton of sense to me. The gunplay was great, but I didn't understand the subclasses, the armor system, or how anything worked together. Weapon perks were a foreign language to me. Hell, I didn't even understand how certain weapons worked. Fusions felt weird and I couldn't get the hang of breech-loading grenade launchers. I was completely lost, and while my friend did occasionally try to help me, most of it failed to click in my tiny brain. As a result, my interest in the game came and went seemingly on a whim. I hopped on for an hour or two at most, usually enough to complete a mission or two. Then I'd bounce because I didn't feel the need to do anything else. There was seasonal stuff going on as well, but I couldn't keep it all straight, so I stuck with the main campaigns to keep it as simple as possible. Eventually, I finished up the Forsaken campaign, but didn't feel any better about my knowledge of the game. I began to realize that large portions of the story were hidden in parts of the game I had very little, if any, access to, whether it be a collectible in a raid or a piece of armor or weapon from an activity I had never set foot in. Hell, I remember one time launching a Nightfall wondering what this was all about, only to realize I hadn't matched with anyone and it was significantly harder than any strike I had ever done. I also inadvertently stumbled into the Shattered Throne once as well when I was exploring the Dreaming City. This was back when the dungeon could only be accessed during a specific curse week and from a specific location in the Dreaming City. I ran around and managed to get past the opening encounter, only to die on the catwalk section because I didn't realize the platform came to an end, causing me to plummet to my death. This brought up a wipe screen, which then started me all the way back at the beginning of the dungeon. That was my cue to bail on that activity. It would be a long time before I'd revisit that dungeon. Shadowkeep was announced, as was Bungie's split from Activision, which was quite a time in the game's history. Most players believed that Activision was responsible for the ever-increasing presence of Eververse, and that Bungie was better off without them. A slew of changes to the game were coming, and including Armor 2.0, which meant maybe I'd actually stand a chance of understanding the armor system and armor mods, something that had eluded me to this point. Shadowkeep was my first day one experience with the franchise. Well, kind of. I didn't play the first day because of work, and in fact didn't get on for a few days, which ended up working out because the servers were absolutely on fire for that DLC launch. By the time I got on, the initial excitement over the moon returning to the game had been substantially reduced, with some veteran players beginning to use the phrase recycled content on a regular basis. While the moon was new for me, as were many of the things that came back with it, it wasn't new for those veteran players, and those same players had been hoping for some new things to find. Instead, the moon was more or less how they remembered it, and that wasn't always a good thing. The fact that many of the fights we had were with recycled bosses from Destiny's past, it felt like insult was being added to injury for veterans. I know one person I followed closely was very upset at how little was actually new about the moon, and the campaign for Shadowkeep wasn't much better. There were some neat missions, don't get me wrong, and Eris Morn was a lot of fun to interact with, but so much of the campaign revolved around just running around the moon, and most of it was pretty tedious. While I had a chance to learn a new armor system and felt like I could actually stand a chance with my gear, I continued to be annoyed at how much busy work there was. I also just didn't enjoy how the campaign ended. It felt like a massive cliffhanger, and given how little I understood about the depth of the story being told, it didn't make a lot of sense to me. I distinctly remember watching the final cutscene and remarking, "That's it? That's the end?" In any case, I played a fair amount of Season 8 until I once again grew disinterested and only came back for the final Vex incursion mission of the season. It was underwhelming, and another group of friends I was playing with had pulled me into Arma 3, so I spent a lot more time there than in Destiny 2. I'd pop in a couple of times over the next couple of seasons, but that was about it. By this point, I was in a clan though, and the idea of being able to play with more people pulled me back. That and Bungie announced that a bunch of content was getting yoinked from the game. The clan wanted to run through all the original raids as there was a triumph for it in that year's Moment of Triumph seal, and there were exotics that people wanted as well. Season 11, aka Season of Arrivals, arrived, and the first real epiphany I'd have in the game took place during that pivotal season. A few things happened that made the season more interesting. The first, of course, was the sunsetting of content. There was just a tremendous amount of urgency to get certain things done before it was removed from the game. The second was a better understanding of what was happening because the seasonal story seemed to actually tell more of the story instead of hiding it. This had always been a complaint of mine, and Arrivals was much more interesting because there was so much more just front and center. At least that's how it felt to me. Third, this was the season that introduced Witherhoard and Falling Guillotine, still some of the best weapons this game has ever seen. There was also a new dungeon too, Prophecy, that was free for all players. It was just a really good time in the game, and for the first time for me personally, it felt like I was really starting to get the hang of actually playing the game. The systems made more sense to me, and I was starting to thrive a bit. I was still not good at the game. My experiences in 0 Hour and the Whisper proved this repeatedly, but I was better than I had been, which is something. I managed to secure clears of all the soon-to-be sunset raids from Leviathan, including a prestige clear, to Eater of Worlds, also a prestige clear, to Spire of Stars, again prestige, to Crown of Sorrow, and finally Scourge of the Past. While I didn't get any exotic weapons to drop, I was able to tick those raids off as completed. I also played through the main campaigns one more time on my newly created Warlock and saw some things I had initially missed in my first playthrough that helped make the current events in the game make more sense. Arrivals was my most played season to that point, and while there was a lengthy break in the middle, I came back for the last month of the season to finish up things I needed to get done. For the first time, I kind of knew what was going on in the game and was able to understand what was happening with the pyramid ships and the stakes that we were facing. I was ready for the next expansion. Beyond Light arrived and the journey for Stasis began. This time I was there on day one, albeit later in the day, and blitzed my way through the story. I enjoyed it, even if the constant teasing of Stasis was annoying, but I wasn't particularly enamored with Aramis as a villain. That's mostly because I didn't know who the hell she was and why she was front and center. Still, I was invested in what was happening and charged full steam ahead through most of the post-campaign missions that you had to do to finish earning Stasis. Then, just as I was fully investing in the game, my health struck a blow. I'd become more and more lethargic over the course of the first few weeks of the expansion until it reached a familiar point for me. I had experienced the things I've been feeling before many years ago, but this time it was worse. Pain in my side, lower back pain, constant nausea, and no energy spell to kidney stone. Or as I found out a few weeks later, multiple kidney stones. This would sideline me in most aspects of my life for the next few months as I worked towards trying to resolve the issue. As a result, I missed most of seasons 12 and 13, although there were a couple of points where I felt alive enough to sit at my desk and actually play for a bit. However, a few weeks into season 14, I had a procedure to help alleviate the issue, and I ended up passing multiple pieces of stones over a couple of weeks, which led to me finally getting back to feeling better and allowed me to venture back into the world of Destiny 2. Adventure did I ever. Season 14, aka Season of the Splicer, was and remains to this day one of my favorite seasons of all time. I forced myself to spend more time in the game, watch more guides to learn about builds, and finally spent some time with My Name is Bice videos to understand the story better. I watched his entire History of Destiny video, the 4+ hour version, and gained a better appreciation for what was happening in the game. Dado and others helped me learn about how to actually properly play the game as opposed to winging it like I had been. I even bothered to read, which led me to finally understanding how breach loading GLs actually worked. You know, holding the fire button down until you wanted to detonate it, not just hoping for a direct hit and missing 90% of the time. With this season being all about breach and clear, I had to learn how to use GLs and did. To this day, they are still some of my favorite weapon types to use, and not just the easy to use wave frames. I put together a Warmind cell build I had seen used by Glad and others and watched as entire rooms of ads just disappeared. It was the first time I truly felt like I was getting the hang of the game, and it was intoxicating. I wanted to do more. I aspired to do harder content. I knew of Grandmaster Nightfalls and wanted to test myself in them, but there was a problem with that. Most of the people I had been playing with just weren't, or if they weren't playing frequently, and when they did, there was a lot of complaining. I was thriving and trying to do more, but I was often alone in this, feeling as most were very much in the throes of burnout and not wanting to engage in the game. I had never felt more alone in a video game than during this period of time. But still, I was having fun. I sussed out Osiris very early on, convinced he was being impersonated by Savathun, and wasn't surprised at the events of the season-ending cutscene. I knew something was up and couldn't wait to find out in Season 15. Season 15, or Season of the Lost, comes around and my suspicions are dead on. I was fully invested in the story of this game at this point and was relishing every revelation that we were provided. I also made a decision that this season I wasn't going to play on my Hunter as much and instead focused on my Warlock. I didn't want to be a one-trick pony, a decision made in part because 95% of the clan I was in were Hunters, which led to some interesting scenarios in the endgame, but also because I just wanted to experience more of the game. I played enough to get through most of what the season was going to have to offer before taking a bit of a break, mostly because Season 15 was going to be another 6-month season and I wasn't going to burn myself out on the game. So I took a couple of weeks away from the game to do some other things instead. Tired of being a solo player, I began looking for a community I could potentially vibe with and maybe actually play the game with. I spent a lot of time bouncing around various Twitch streams looking for that perfect fit. While I did stumble across some interesting channels, none of them felt completely right for one reason or another. One day I decided to check one more channel in my recommended listing. They had a good number of viewers, but more importantly, they had an active chat. I rarely speak when I'm checking out a stream, or even streams I was a regular in, but I decided to say hi in this one. I was immediately greeted by several other chatters saying hi back, which was unusual for me to experience. Streamer was also very engaging with their chat, so there was a constant conversation stream happening, which was something that excited me. That streamer? All-time Brianna. I didn't know it at the time, but my entire Destiny 2 experience was about to change in a massive way. Now, mind you, this wouldn't happen immediately, but was rather a slow burn. And it wasn't necessarily because B and I clicked that fast, but was something that developed over time. I would end up taking a bit of a break after that, but would come back to the game by the time fall came around. At the time, she did an event called Drinkstony, where she'd pair an exotic weapon with an alcoholic drink, and as a community they'd do something within Destiny 2. It just so happened that one of these was coming up, and it just conveniently happened to be dungeon focused, and your boy just happened to need a couple of dungeon runs. Didn't know it at the time, but these dungeon runs would be the catalyst for a bunch of friendships that I didn't know I needed, but I'm grateful I have now. The first was Pit of Heresy, which I needed for one of my Solstice armor pieces. I got to do that dungeon with B and Main Pain, and it was a fun experience. I was still very green with the dungeon, so them being patient with me as I went through it was huge. The next dungeon was Shattered Throne with B and Flip the Giant, as I was working on the Wishender quest at the time. This was another important one, as Flip would be the catalyst for much of what would happen months later. Funny enough though, that was it for the most part at the time. I did play with some people in the community from time to time, but for the most part, I continued my solo adventures. But as the year went on, Flip started joining me on a regular basis. He helped me with the Hawkmoon mission, helped me with the Shattered Realms that I needed to complete, and did a few other things on the side. However, the moment that my Destiny 2 journey changed forever was in January of 2022, right before the Witch Queen expansion. That was when Flip messaged me about doing my first ever Grandmaster Nightfall, something I had wanted to do for a very long time at that point. I of course said yes, and later would be joined by another future friend, Follow Me Unfaded, as we took on the Devil's Lair GM. And in my first ever GM experience, I found myself as the last Guardian standing in a room with 2 Overload champions and about a bazillion other enemies with no real way to revive my teammates because of where they had died. Somehow, some way, I managed to get past that part on my own, revive my teammates, and keep the run alive. We ended up failing in the boss room, but it was an invaluable experience for me, something I wouldn't trade for anything. After a couple of attempts, we finally got the clear, and while I didn't realize it at the time, was well on my way to earning the Conqueror title. About the same time, I started getting pulled into raids with B & Company by Flip. I had my first ever Vault of Glass experience that same January, as well as my first Deep Stone Crypt. I didn't just add clear either, as the mantra of the group was you actually had to do the mechanics of the raid. It was invigorating, and I was absolutely hooked on Destiny 2's endgame. I wanted more raids, more GMs, and I'd get my wish. I've now had several dozen raid runs with this group, some of them serious, some of them with mean weapons, and all of them a ton of fun. That said, I wasn't completely in B's circle of gaming friends just yet. I was certainly on the cusp of it, and I got to spend more time in-game with her and the rest of the group as the months went by. Flip, Faded, and I became known as the trifecta of chaos, and often could be found grouping up for any day one activity that came around. To really put it into perspective, I went from never having a DM to respond to having multiple DMs actively going from individuals, as well as a multitude of DM groups that I am a part of. My experience in the game at this point had been profoundly changed. And my child is singing very loudly. I was no longer a solo player, but rather part of a larger group and was able to experience things I hadn't been able to experience before. Because of B & Company, I've had the opportunity to do 3 contest mode raids, with 1 clear, every dungeon on day 1, the last 2 legendary campaigns on day 1, as well as Guild my Conqueror title 7 times. I was lucky enough to spend a week with this group down in Florida last summer at GCX, and while I can't go this year, I know those who are going to have a great time. Back to the game now. The Witch Queen expansion arrived in February of 2022, and in my opinion, is one of the best pieces of content that Bungie has ever produced. Yes, that includes going back to Halo. That's how much I enjoyed it. The storytelling was tremendous, and the legendary campaign was absolutely what the game needed. It felt like an actual challenge, and the Savathûn boss fight was incredibly epic. This was peak Destiny with the subclass updates and the quality of life changes made to the game. While I know Lightfall didn't resonate as much within the community, I actually enjoyed it and wasn't as bothered by it as some people were. I do agree that putting a bunch of the important narrative in the seasons wasn't a great idea though. That content is going to be gone forever with the final shape, but I understood what Bungie was doing. That said, the game did find itself in a very bad place by October of 2023. Layoffs hit Bungie and people were incensed at how tone-deaf the executives came across as. It didn't help that the game was also in the midst of a very long period of poor stability, which also contributed to a massive dip in the player base. It was a tough time and it became increasingly hard to give people a reason to try the game in the first place. That said, Into the Light, a free content drop that came at the end of the Lightfall expansion cycle, reinvigorated the player base. Bungie introduced Onslaught, a horde mode style game mode into the game, and brought back fan favorite weapons. They also introduced Pantheon, a limited time raid boss gauntlet that got progressively harder each week. They brought back the Whisper and 0 Hour, 2 of the best missions they've ever made, with some new twists added. Bungie finally seemed to take a step back and genuinely deliver what players wanted. Through all of that, I've made some of the best friends you could ask for just because I played this game. I couldn't ask for a better group of goobers, and I hope they truly understand how much they all mean to me. That's the beauty of this game, though. No one's story is exactly the same. Flip has been part of this franchise since the Destiny 1 beta, through all of Destiny 1 and all of Destiny 2. Others came in right before, or in some cases, right after I did. Our journeys have been vastly different in so many ways, yet the destination remains the same as we approach the final shape. We even have someone who's only been playing for a few months now, but has found herself completely hooked. Hi, Cass. It's been so much fun helping her learn and to understand this game, and it gave me great joy to listen to her talk about how much Bife's newest History of Destiny video has helped her understand this goofy game. Destiny as a franchise isn't perfect. It's had its shares of ups and downs throughout its 10-year history. It's been a dead game more often than not in the eyes of outsiders and people jaded by the game. And yet, here we are, on the cusp of the finale of the Light and Dark saga. And there's nowhere else I'd rather be than here with the best friends a Guardian could ask for.